questions? Come on. There's got to be, oh, we got one? Can you tell me why you think there is such a different response from people in Quebec to the flooding as opposed to people along the southern shore of Lake Ontario?
That's an important question and a hard question, and one we've thought a lot about. Let me ask first, how many Canadians do we have here? We have some Canadians? That's good. I'm going to say some things, and maybe you'll have some different views. I've spent 7 years now working closely in a binational relationship. And, you know, we speak the same language, and we're so much alike that we think that there really are no differences, but there are differences. I think one of the differences that, I think one of the differences is that Canadians tend to trust their governments more. There's a hostility in the U.S., a distrust, especially since the 80s, the 90s, and on into now, where we're hopefully at the peak, and it won't go any higher. You know, that you can't trust these experts, you can't trust these elites, you can't trust, and I don't mean just immediately now in the United States. I think the Canadians have a less adversarial relationship with authority than on the U.S. side. I think that's part of it. I think in certain areas, look, Canadians were hit hard. Millions of people were hit very hard. Real damages there, like there were real damages to smaller numbers of people, but real damages here. But in Canada, in some areas, going back to the 50s, after Hurricane Hazel, which was a terrible event, many people died in the 50s on the north shore of Lake Ontario. Canada started saying, we cannot protect this area, so we'll buy, they started buying people out and not giving permits for rebuilding, and there's a lot more open space there that takes the hit, where we have housing in areas that would not be allowed because they are so vulnerable, they will flood again, and so there's a different attitude in that. But I am really interested in that, and I also think it's kind of like a biblical question: what makes humans human, and human nature? And if we understood that, well, we'd be a different species. Anything else?
Yeah, I'll just add there are differences between Quebec and Ontario as well. Yeah. Different policies about land use that have developed over time. Quebec is in the turmoils now after their floods in the Richelieu River a few years ago, and now the St. Lawrence. They are revisiting how they handle property in the floodplain. We have flood insurance in the United States, Canada doesn't. So there's a lot of legal differences that make the responses different.
We have not just flood insurance, but we have tax subsidized flood insurance in many places. Now in Florida, that's, well, we still have some federal money going in there, but the private sector won't even insure in many places. So I think the insurance policies are and the subsidies for insurance are a reflection of some of these differences. Lee, I saw this gentleman's hand, and actually, go ahead.
Perhaps I was misinformed, but I thought I understood Montreal to be a very, in particular, a very sensitive harbor, that you couldn't flow the water up too quickly because the ships would go aground, and you can't hold back too much because you're going to flood the city rather much faster than any other area. So I've always told, and I'm from this area, the U.S. side, but that's what I've always told my friends about the water.
He's right. You go ahead.
Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I would say it's complicated. First of all, the depth of the river and the harbor in Montreal is really important for how much ships load, and that makes a big difference, especially with the container ships. The rate that you flow water is really different in the upper St. Lawrence, the slope of that, and that can make for safety problems. I mean, this year in particular, ships, a lot of them used pilot boats, tugboats, to help them guide the way through. There is the ice formation problem that we have to slow releases during the period of time when ice is forming. If we don't do that, then there'll be ice jam flooding, and that will affect Quebec disastrously as it did before the dam. So the board has to consider all of these things, and Plan 2014 considers all these things. Gathering all that knowledge and wisdom that we've gained, not only from data, but from the management of the river over the last 50 years.
Thank you. Maxine?
Yes.
Why don't you, there's a mic.
You know, we were impacted by the flood. And the question comes from many residents in the village. They want to know whether or not you're going to continue the increased outflows, or when you reach the upper limits, are you going to start to pull back?
So, you know, the inflows now are, they've changed several times this week.
The inflows or outflows?
The outflows have
The
changed.
outflows.
As Lana said, it's, if it isn't setting a record, then it's close to a record, and that's been true for the last few weeks. You have to go back to 1998 to find any winter releases this high. And this is all done according to Plan 2014, so the board isn't deviating. As you know, because I'm sure you followed this, when the board did hit the trigger point last April, the releases they made actually followed Plan 2014. Again, Plan 2014 is based on a lot of wisdom from the past. So the board, given the freedom to do anything else, still did what Plan 2014 stipulated. So the last projections I saw, and I'm not a board member, last projections I saw were that the Plan 2014 would most likely draw the river down to about average levels by next summer. But I have to make reinforce a point that's been made before. There's a game tomorrow. If you ask me to make a bet on it last June, then I would have some trouble. But if you give me until Tuesday, I can be very wise. The IJC always has to make these bets in June. So right now the plan builds in all of the statistics from past years and places a very smart bet, and then they'll revisit that weekly to make sure that they are doing the smartest thing. Because, as Lana said, 2016 and 2017 started out almost exactly the same. And 2016 ended up in a drought with below average lake levels. One is just as likely as the other.
I'm going to speak in one more question for you.
Okay.
And that is, you talked about your adaptive management strategy and trying to pull in more, a larger group.
Yeah.
I sincerely hope you're going to start to pull in some of the communities along the South Shore.
Yeah, absolutely. We're obviously, that's important to us. A lot of the pain that was felt came, I think, because people expected that more could be done than was possible. And if you feel that government could have saved you and didn't do so because you were an unfeeling person, then your reaction is quite a bit different. So if you're being flooded and you realize that this is a problem that couldn't be avoided, that would have been exactly the same under the old plan, that happened in 52 and 73 and 93 and will happen again, then you have to say, so what do we do to make this not happen again? Because this lake flooding is some of the worst flooding you can have.
And I just might say, part of it is managing expectations. Part of it is information that needs to be shared. The scientists aren't the only one with information. That's why Save the River, who has many scientists, but not everybody. Apparently, Lee's not a scientist. I always thought you were since that first time I met you. Yeah, on television. You know, but some of it is managing expectations. It's being realistic about what we can do. You know, it's just the force of nature is so much more powerful than we. So I'll just say this. Yesterday, again, I mentioned we had a meeting in Albany, but we'll have many more meetings. We have frequent meetings. And the idea, part of that discussion is how do we incorporate the people who are most impacted? How do we communicate better? We think we've tried hard to communicate. My phone I've talked to a lot of people. It's been very helpful to me to hear from people, including yourself. But I hope it's also been helpful to people to hear from me. The IJC is not this, you know, this black box with robots inside it. It's people like me. I'm a riparian. I'm on Lake Michigan. I've watched Lake Michigan for 75 years. I've watched houses fall into the lake, especially in the mid-'80s. But you know what? They're going into the lake again. It's real, but it doesn't mean we can stop it. We can try and prepare for it. We can try and help homeowners know where to site their homes and their shoreline protections and what's realistic and what's not realistic. But a lot of it, Maxine, as you know, is managing expectations. Let's be realistic, because if we're not realistic, we'll be more vulnerable if we expect too much.
So maybe one more question, but I want to add to that, and I referenced the first question the commissioner ever asked me, which was, why can't you reach across the table? I want to tell you, maybe after 5 years, I have an answer. Maxine and I talked today. I think I can speak.
Oh, that's great.
Speak for Save the River and reiterate her willingness and give our willingness to be part of the continuing effort, because we've talked, we think resiliency, we think being able to get people on the shore in a way that works so that they're not flooded, we can enjoy the shared use, but we don't go through a cycle again. But we're ready. Clearly Maxine is ready. So.
Thank you. And I also want to say just one more thing about Maxine. You know, after we talked, and I encouraged her as I encourage everybody. Not everybody's going to, because you don't want to run against Mayor Zimmer. But, you know, be involved with the decisions that your community makes, as well as your provincial, state, federal governments make. You can, I mean, we live in one of two great democracies, and be involved in the public decisions as well as the decisions that you make for your own property, because especially in New York, it's so much authority is granted to the local, so the locals communities have to make the right decisions to maximize the protections that are available to them. So involvement.
One more, I hate to be like that, but I'm going to let Kendall pick. I won't get in trouble.
I want to say one thing. I really like what both of you said. I've thought since the high water, it was like the perfect storm of weather conditions. I'm old enough to be on the river to see about every 20 years we have high water. As a matter of perspective, though, in the overall, am I correct in that weren't there thousands of people in Montreal that were evacuated from their year-round homes?
Yes.
And I mention that because, yes, this high water was a hardship on everyone, but for the most part, we're in a recreational area. Yes, it affected business, but I was very, very sensitive to the people in their year-round homes being totally displaced. So that is a matter of perspective. And again, like
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.